Hi, this is Darren from SimNation. Just want to do a quick video tonight on SNCFL, which is SimNation's Draft Day Sports College Football 2023 League. For those of you not aware, this league has been around for 38 seasons, so that's probably roughly about 7 years. So it's a very long-standing league. We have about 21 active coaches right now. Um, Most of the coaches have multiple teams, so if you were to look online, you'd see a whole bunch of different names, but most of those are one of 21 coaches. The reason for doing this video is just want to do a quick recap, but also want to talk about the future of this league. For those not aware, Draft Day Sports College Football 2024 has been released. I'll do a video on that in probably next weekend and talk about my thoughts about it. Overall, I like the new version. We will convert to that version when we move over to the new season in about 3 weeks. So just so you know, we run 3 sims a week, Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, and um, that'll get us roughly there in about 3 weeks. And of course, this league feeds into the WWPF, which is our Draft Day Sports Pro Football League, where most of the college coaches actually are in the pro league as well. So we do have some good teams available. I'll talk about that in a second. But we've just completed week 15, which means the regular season is over. We're now into the championship week, which will then feed into bowls and then, of course, into the playoffs. As you can see, Maryland is still number one. So Maryland is one of my mini teams. Miami is Gary. Probably the strongest number two you'll find. I actually think that Miami should be number one, but the CPU doesn't feel that way. Kind of a shock is Washington State at number three, followed by fellow powerhouse in the Pac-12, UCLA, who is Stewart. Stewart also has a number five team in Western Michigan. And then, of course, Shark comes in at number six with his Georgia Bulldogs. Skelter's at number seven with his Louisiana Monroe Warhawks, despite the fact that they've lost two non-conference games. They'd really have to mess up really badly not to make the playoffs at this point. Frankie comes in at number eight with his Iowa Hawkeyes. If you're interested in joining the league, number nine is Texas. They are a CPU team right now. Oklahoma State again is Frankie. Wisconsin is Joe Dorman, who has just done a really phenomenal job with that team so far, given where they were previously. So, um, just hats off to him. Though they should make the playoffs. Texas Tech is one of my teams, and you may remember them. I did a zero to hero thing with them, where I managed to take them to the playoffs in the second season I had them. NC State is Van, and Van is kind of in an interesting spot because he has to play in the ACC championship against Gary. Uh, I think Van's capable of beating Gary, but he can't afford to get blown out. Otherwise, he may drop out of the top 16. And again, top 16 is important because anyone in the top 16 goes to the playoffs. Michigan again is Stewart. You notice that he has multiple teams. He's a really phenomenal coach. Sample comes in at number 15 with his Florida State Seminoles. DP comes in at number 16 with his Ohio State Buckeyes, and he is a Buckeye fan, so he's probably happy to be there. Number 17 is Iowa State, which is Shark again. Steve comes in at number 18 with his Oklahoma Sooners. Vance, another one of Van's teams, Oregon State, is at number 20, which is pretty good for Van, given some of the challenges that he had the previous season with Oregon State. They definitely have really turned it around. Um, Nebraska's open. Duke is another one. I want to say Stewart has Duke. And yeah, he does. And he's just done a phenomenal job. For those of you in the real world know that Duke just knocked off Clemson. Uh, I went to high school in South Carolina, so anytime Clemson loses, I'm happy. And by the way, I'm not a Gamecock fan. I'm happy when South Carolina loses too. Central Michigan is my zero to hero team. I'll do a whole video on that. That's a whole different thing. So right now, if you were to look at it, if the playoffs started today, it'd be Maryland versus Ohio State, which would be the second time that those two teams meet this season. DP doesn't want that. So what DP is hoping is that Iowa loses and he can somehow move up out of that 16 slot. But teams that can actually move, if we look at championship week, and hopefully this isn't a spoiler for any of the coaches, but you have Miami versus NC State. So this is Gary versus Van. I mentioned that earlier. If we look at the matchup, they are really two different teams when you get down to it. Van's NC State is really more of a running team versus Gary's team is just a straight up balanced football team where they can get you on the ground and they can get you through the air. Jesse Payne is one of those quarterbacks you should keep an eye on. He's just had a phenomenal season. Van's knowing this one a little banged up, which is one of the reasons why I don't think he'll be able to take Gary. Plus, Gary has the number one ranked defense and one of the top ranked offenses. So I really want Van to win this game, but I think Miami's a little bit too much. Texas Tech versus Texas. Texas Tech pretty much has to win this game to stay in the playoffs for the second straight season. Many of you remember I did the video, I think like 2 seasons ago, where I took over Texas Tech. They were one of the worst teams in the league, and I've now have them on the cusp of making their second straight playoff appearance. And I've talked about some of how I did that in previous videos. Texas is really hard to beat. So in fairness, Texas is really Kevin. Uh, Even though he doesn't coach that team anymore, a lot of the success that Texas is having is because of the players he recruited and the system he installed there, which makes them a very tough out. So the hope here is Texas Tech can beat them. Otherwise, Texas Tech is going to have to hope for some things to happen. Iowa versus Maryland. This will be a good game. Me versus Frankie. Him and I are always competitive. Unfortunately, I just think Maryland's dialed in right now. So I don't think Iowa's the team that can potentially beat Maryland. It'll be close, but I think Maryland wins that one and just continues their dominance of the Big Ten, which is not what happens in real life. Western Michigan versus Akron. This one's a formality. Western Michigan with Stewart is really like a Big Ten caliber squad. They're just gonna stomp Akron. The only skill that I think Western Michigan had this season was against Central Michigan, where they almost beat them. Um, Washington versus UCLA. If this one goes the way it normally does, UCLA will win it. Stewart and I meet a lot in the playoffs, in championship games. He normally wins the championship. Now, this is weird because some seasons we literally will play 4 times, these two teams, or 3 times, sorry. But that won't happen this season because they didn't meet in the regular season, which is why they're both 3 and 4 in their rankings respectively. So I do like UCLA in this one. Washington State really is a one-trick pony, but again, Merriman is a senior and he's having a phenomenal season. I'll talk about that in a second. Probably what I think is going to be one of the best games is Georgia versus Louisiana Monroe. And Skelter's probably yelling at me already about don't say that. Even though Louisiana Monroe's lost 2 in a row, they have one of the best running backs in Ashby. Georgia, I can't remember if they've got Noah back yet or not. Yeah, they've got Noah back. So Noah is a really good quarterback for Georgia. With him in the game, I think that they have a very strong chance of beating Louisiana Monroe. And I mentioned Ashby. As you can see, through 12 games, he ran for over 2,200 yards, which is pretty amazing. And unlike in uncharacteristically Skelter sense, he actually passed for over 1,900 yards. So, but I think that this one will really come down to can Sharks stop Ashby from running and can Skelter stop Noah from passing. Whoever wins that battle is going to win the game. Nevada versus Boise State. These are two CPU teams, if I remember correctly. I'll just double check that to make sure because sometimes I get it wrong. Uh, yeah, two CPU teams. I think Boise State wins this one. They're pretty good this season. Tulane versus Cincinnati. I always root against Cincinnati, and I don't know why that is, but I do. I think Tulane wins this one, and Tulane needs to win this one to have a chance at the playoffs. And then in the game that really doesn't mean much, it's Troy versus Louisiana Lafayette. Again, two CPU teams again, so we'll see how that plays out. But again, NC State really has to win. Texas Tech really has to win, and then all the other ones where you have a ranked team, except for the case of Tulane, those teams can afford to lose and still make the playoffs. Now, again, if they lose, it would mess up some of the other teams in the top 25 or top 16. Sorry. When we look at the league leaders, there's not too much of a shock here uh, as soon as it decides to come up. Um, you notice, first off, that there aren't many human teams. Todoro Irvin, the funny story about him is he was a Maryland quarterback who got stuck behind first Marcus Witten, who of course is now, if you follow the WWPF, is the New York Giants star quarterback. And then he got stuck behind Ron Baker, who's Maryland's quarterback. Uh, Julian McKinney, considering when Stewart took over Duke, that's pretty good. And he's really got them dialed in there with that. From a passing touchdown perspective, again, Texas, a lot of credit here goes to Kevin. He didn't get to enjoy the fruits of that, and he's at Rutgers now, and he's really turned around that program. We'll talk about that in a second. But then again, you see Jesse Payne, and I mentioned him earlier. He's going to probably be one of the top picks in the draft coming up. Um, from a passing rating perspective, again, Goldman is having a pretty phenomenal season. I think if I remember correctly, he's a senior. So he should go pretty high in the draft. He kind of reminds me of Hollingsworth a little bit. His actual stats are very much like Hollingsworth was coming out of college. And Hollingsworth was a fifth round pick who turned out to be one of the better quarterbacks in the WWPF. Rushing wise, Merriman won the regular season title. He broke 10,000 yards in his career. He's not going to get the record though, because the person who holds that Bynum from Louisiana Monroe rushed for 11,000 yards. And the difference is Merriman's been doing it in roughly about 15 games a year. Uh, Bynum did it in like 13. So Ashby should be up there on the list as well. McDougal, I think, will finish his career as like number 3 on the list. Merriman will finish number 2 on the list. And then, of course, you have Tong, plays for Steve at Oklahoma, and Vang, who plays for Maryland, who's had a really good career so far. Rushing touchdowns, every year this is interesting. Last year was McDougal. This year it's Burdick. Burdick is, of course, the running back for Stewart at UCLA. Receiving yards wise, again, the Texas Longhorns have had a really great season. This isn't a shock. Timothy Greenwood has actually been quite a really good wide receiver. Again, he's a senior. He'll probably go high in the draft because he has the dynamic of a wide receiver that will play really well in the pros. Um, and then, of course, I'm going to skip over tackles because that every year is weird. You won't see a whole lot of human teams here, but Farrell has had a really good season. Jolly is, I think, a senior, a sophomore, who's also had a good thing. Um, my hope is that these two teams don't find each other in the playoffs. Frankie has a really good squad there. So, and then again, as not many human control teams will show uphill, but 8 interceptions is a pretty good mark for both Plunkett and Weaver. So they've definitely had a really good season. When we look at the standings, just going through this, some kind of shocks. So no shock that Van won. Kind of expected him to win the ACC Atlantic this year. Florida State was going to challenge him throughout. Florida State's biggest problem is they haven't been able to keep Asa Garcia, who's their star quarterback, healthy throughout the season. If you look at the recruiting news, it's all Clemson. Spoof has done a great job recruiting, even though his record doesn't show it. But there really should be no excuse for him not having a good season next year with how he's recruiting. We talked about Gary with another undefeated season. Gary is just constantly uphill, but Stewart is gaining some strength, and then of course you have Bama at Virginia Tech. So I think next year Stewart may challenge Gary, but Gary's carrying a 98 prestige team at Miami, which means that even though it doesn't look great, if you look, he's recruited the number one overall recruit in um, this draft class. So yeah, I think he's gonna have a pretty good season next year. And I didn't recruit this guy, and a lot of people have asked me why. Is one, he's out in California. Two, I have a quarterback issue already at Maryland. There's no way I was going to get him. Um, a little bit of a shock here is Cable with Central Florida is coming in at 4-8. Maybe expected a little bit more there, but he'll sooner or later get that righted. He's been doing good with the recruiting classes. I do kind of wish Travis would come back at Houston. Houston for a while was able to be very, very good. So Travis, if you're listening to this, definitely, dude, you're welcome back anytime you want. For those who don't know, Travis was just a really good coach. He took Houston from being nothing to something. In the Big 12, this is the one that has the most human coaches in it. Nebraska's now open. LA Smog had them. I'm sorry, West Virginia is now open. LA Smog had them, but he decided to step down from the league. So both Texas and West Virginia, Baylor, Texas Christian, and Kansas State are all open. But if you look at this, Texas Tech made it in the championship game by virtue of Oklahoma State beating Oklahoma. Had Oklahoma won, they would have been in the championship game because they had the head-to-head competition with Texas Tech, who they beat earlier in the season. As you can see, is Sharks still doing a wonderful job with Iowa State. They were pretty horrible when he took them over. Starfinder's found a lot of consistency with Brigham Young, but I think he'll be looking to make this next step next season. And as you can see, is Frankie's up to his old tricks where he's just really recruiting well. Now, recruiting in 2024 will be pretty radically different. So you may see some shocks that you normally wouldn't see. And of course, this last week, Dante Kelly committed to Oklahoma, and that's a pretty big get for Steve at Oklahoma. In the Big Ten, Maryland is once again the big team in the East. Michigan and Ohio State should make the playoffs. Can't underscore how good of a job Kevin has done with Rutgers. He's really turned them around. And as he gets more talent in there, he should just get better and better. DWK should be getting Penn State back online here shortly. He started really strong this season and then got into Big Ten play, and I think he had some injuries that kind of derailed it. Frankie really has Iowa in a good place right now, so um, continue to expect him to do well. Joe Dorman has done a great job at Wisconsin. Should be in the playoffs. Nebraska's open, so if anybody's interested in them, I definitely would recommend them. This is Starfinder again. I'm trying to remember if Purdue is somebody, but as you can see, really this is a Russian conference. Even though they do, Ohio State does throw the ball, and I don't know why Maryland got a 5-star. They are pretty stacked at running back, but you can see Ohio State and Wisconsin have had a pretty good recruiting run, whereas Maryland has been pouring in 4 stars and some 5 stars. Conference USA, 0 to hero. This was a massive fail for Southern Miss. Didn't get. They should go to a bowl, so I guess it's a limited success. But they weren't. They didn't do as well as I had hoped. And then, of course, in the case of the East, SOA and JMU. I don't know how active he actually is, but I think he has uploaded recently, so he's still got that team, and a 6-6 with bowl berth is pretty good for him. And then of course you have Florida Atlantic, who is JP, who is still working through some of the stuff with and Florida Atlantic's a hard team to try to bring back, so we'll see how he does. They'll pretty confident. He's proved himself to be a pretty good coach in the WWPF. Um, and then if you look, we won't look at the independents. Um, if we look at the MAC, Western Michigan coming into the season was the favorite to win just the whole conference, if not make it to the playoffs. Central Michigan had a pretty good 0-hero. If I had just won one more game with them, they probably would have made the playoffs, but I didn't. So um, they'll have to settle for a bowl, which isn't bad considering how bad they were previously. Skelter's done a really good job of turning around Buffalo, even though it didn't pan out quite the way he wanted it to. Still a really good job. And as you can see, Western Michigan just dominates the recruiting scene. Um, in the Mountain West, Colorado State was my pick to win the conference. Boise State won the Mountain. That's a little bit of a shock, but that happens. Don is back at Air Force. The record doesn't indicate. He just literally took him back over. So I do look for good things out of him, though, and he should contend for the title. Nevada was a little bit of a shock to me. Didn't expect them to be up there. UNLV, maybe. I thought that they might be able to pull it out just because of Timmons. But good job for the CPU with Nevada. The Pac-12 didn't expect Washington State to make it through undefeated, but again, they didn't have UCLA on the calendar this year, which is always a good thing. So they definitely have had a great season. They have a really good defense. This will be my last season at Washington State, by the way. I had already pretty much made the decision that once Merriman graduated, that I was going to move to Colorado. I'll take over Colorado, which probably doesn't make Stewart very happy. He's probably going to petition for me to move Colorado into the Big 12, which probably I would do honestly and candidly, and then just drop Texas Tech. Oregon State, great job by Van. He's really turning that program around. Stanford is Skelter. Not a good job from him this year, but he'll get that figured out. Um, it's a little bit different than the SEC in the Pac-12, but I look for him to get that turned around. And then, of course, Bama has California. Cal was a train wreck before he took them over, so he's got a season or two before he can get that turned around. UCLA, I mentioned, is Stewart. He had a really good season. Brian has USC. USC was also a mess when he took it over, but as you can see, he's recruiting well. So it'll be interesting to see how all this pans out. In the SEC, a little bit of a vacuum with LSU being back on CPU. Louisiana Monroe, like I said, had a really good beginning to the season before they lost two straight. One of those was to Oklahoma, so it's not the end of the world for them in any way, shape, or form. Alabama right now is, I believe, being coached by DP. And then Georgia, of course, is Shark. He's done a great job there. Florida, Soa. And then Udo's at Tennessee. And he largely wasn't in charge of them last season, so he's dealing with getting them back on the right track. I mentioned Ashby. He's just a phenomenal running back. And as you can see here is DP's doing a really good job of recruiting at Bama. And then, of course, you got Shark at Georgia, and then you got Skelter, who always does a good job. It'll be interesting to see if these guys are actually any good because he does a lot of CPU recruiting, which means that sometimes he gets 5 stars that just aren't very good. And then, of course, in the Sun Belt, the big story here is we had a coach take over Georgia State, who has historically been one of the worst programs in spoof. Give him a year or two, he'll have them on the right track. If you just think about what he's doing with Seattle in the WWPF, he should do pretty well, though. Georgia Southern, DWK has Georgia Southern. He's doing a really good job with them. They should be contending next season for this conference. So overall, as you can see, is we're entering the playoffs. If you had to make me take a guess as who do I think is going to really be in that semifinal, um, I really think it'll come down to who's playing who, but I would expect likely Maryland, Miami, UCLA, and then I like either Georgia or Oklahoma State to make it. So it'll be interesting to see which one does. I think the one team to keep an eye on is if they get into the playoffs and get dialed in, it would be Iowa State. Um, I know Stewart will say, well, Stewart is actually sitting on the potential to have 4 teams in the playoffs. I think 4 teams. Could be wrong on that, but I'll figure that out later. I think it's really 3 teams, but he should be able to at least get one into the finals this time around. Frankie, Iowa's intriguing, but I think Oklahoma State's the better of the 2 teams. It's just they're out of a harder conference. And then, of course, I would love to see Washington State win the title this year, only because it's my last season with them, but that's not going to happen. They don't match up well with a lot of teams in the top 16. So that's it for now. If you're interested, take a look at the video. I'll drop the links for the league in there. Just let us know. We have an active Slack community. And then also, we are always looking for new coaches. As I mentioned, there are a lot of good teams still available. Like you have Texas is one of them. You have Tulane. You have Nebraska. And then you have some other powerhouses like Auburn and teams like that that are actually free right now that they just need a good coach and then they'll be right back to where they were before. So, hope you find this informative and have a great night.